Doo-doo-dee. It's Nandi.
Hello, friends. You've probably seen my interview with Francesco, where we unveil and discuss Mythic, the newest progression point in Tacticus. I really enjoyed the interview, and I think it's great to hear from the developers directly for these things, so I'd encourage you to check that video out. In summary, Mythic is releasing on patch 1.31 on August 15th. It lets you ascend your characters to a new rarity, and along with that new rarity, you get access to more levels and a new rank called Adamantine. The most unique thing is the addition of relics, which adds a new tactical layer to using your characters. All of a sudden, players are faced with a raft of new progression avenues to think about. Which characters should you prioritize? How should you spend your mythic badges? Today, I'm going to try and take a stab at simplifying all of that. I guess it's worth verbalizing that if you are a newer player, this video probably isn't relevant to you. We're focusing on players for whom Mythic is an active progression point, so probably middle to end game players. It's worth framing the discussion initially using this graph that Francesco shared with me during the aforementioned interview. You can see that initially character abilities scale faster than stats. Things even out by the time you get to level 65 and Adamantine 3, but the initial Mythic release only takes us to 55, so somewhere roughly here. When we are thinking about initial characters and priorities, it's worth keeping this in mind. The ability strength gained from Mythic is going to be more valuable than the stats. When we think about which characters to prioritize, we need to look at game modes where Mythic is going to be both usable and impactful. I think a good framework to look at Mythic is to use the same metrics that I use in my Dirty Dozen video series: Guild Raid, Guild War, and Horde modes, a term used to describe survival and legendary release events. At time of recording, we have been told that War will not have any Mythic rarity caps, so it shouldn't be an initial motivator for Mythic Ascension. Survival will have Mythic rarities before the final so-called impossible wave, but I think Snowprint would be foolish to center rewards around the Mythic level completion. I suspect they will continue to offer the event points and books at lower tiers, so Mythic isn't necessarily a priority here unless you're desperate to be on the leaderboard for vanity's sake. Legendary release events are an interesting one. There will be extra levels here which will correspond to more points and more chests. In my interview, Snowprint explained that if you do really well in legendary release events, you will be able to unlock the legendary character at mythic rarity just through the event. So I definitely think there's value here, and it will factor into our considerations a little bit. The biggest consideration, I think, should be guild raids. Before Mythic and the changes that came to the economy alongside Mythic, guild raids were nearly the be-all and end-all for game progression. The guild shop had everything you could need: badges, experience books, gold, and character shards for really important characters. Basically, most of everything you needed could be found in the guild shop. As a game mode that is present basically all the time, it made sense to prioritize building raid characters and refining raid strategies. With the economy changes and shakeup, that's all changed. We still get raid credits, but the raid store is now mainly for orbs and books. That makes raid overall slightly less useful, but the omnipresent nature, plus the fact that we are going to see mythic bosses basically straight away, means that I think this is the game mode where you should focus your resources. At time of recording, players are probably familiar with the 3 core raid teams in the game. I'd like to use this video as an opportunity to add another team to the mix. You've probably seen me using these guys in the last couple of videos: Carrion, Ragnar, Dante, Karn, and Trajan. It's a legendary heavy team, but the results are undeniable. They're a really strong team with different gameplay and gameplay loops to the multi-hit team. I'll call this team the Custodes team because really they revolve around Carrion and Trajan more than the other characters. My attitude and advice towards raid teams has been to try and have a primary raid team, ideally one that you can use against a variety of bosses, and then have a secondary raid team that you can use to plug gaps where your main raid team struggles. I think the same approach is valid here. The Mech team is an obvious place to start discussions. The team does really well against a range of bosses and side bosses. The nice thing about them is that actually stats influence very little in terms of damage output. As long as your characters survive, their abilities do the heavy lifting. In that sense, Exeter Rowe should be the priority focus in both his active and passive abilities. Next, Tangida's Skitari summons are really important to have as a strong backup. Mythic, I think, potentially increases the spectrum of bosses that you can use this team against. Previously, against the highest levels of the Avatar of Cain and Mortarion, your units couldn't survive the boss active and passive abilities for this to be a consistent option. Now, with the advent of Adamantine, you might be able to survive those boss fights more reliably. If you're interested in doing that, then I would try and bring your characters up to Adamantine and really focus on the characters that are most likely to be in melee against those high damage bosses. Here, again, I would highlight Exeter Row and Tangita. Golgorts used to be really good on this team, but more recent gameplay and testing has shown that Trajan has replaced him, at least at the very top of the meta. For Trajan, you're interested in upgrading his passive, and there's overlap in the Custodes team that we'll come to later. The Psyker team has seen a recent resurgence due to the rework of Ahriman and the addition of the Exorcist Machine of War. This team has typically been best when other teams either couldn't survive the boss attacks, or the boss had really high armor that nullified non-psychic damage. In some ways, the team is invalidated by the stat and power creep elsewhere. To use the Mech team as an example, you might have previously used the Psyker team against the legendary 5 Mortarion because nothing else survived there. Now, there is a reasonable chance that Adamantine gives the mechs more staying power. However, the other side to that argument is that the needle simply shifts. Instead of using the Psyker team as the go-to team against the legendary 5 Mortarion, they simply become the main team for a Mythic 1 Mortarion. This team doesn't really have to tank boss attacks nor soak up a huge amount of damage. If you want the Psyker team to do well, it's really just their abilities you need to focus on. I would prioritize upgrading the Neuroparasite passive on the Neurothrope. You don't actually need a huge amount else here, so it's a nice and relatively cheap secondary team to upgrade. I'm increasingly finding the multi-hit team difficult to choose a single group of 5 because there is variation for each boss. Also, the bosses for the multi-hit niche might now actually be better for the new Custodes team, so the multi-hit team may end up moving or dying out. Nonetheless, it's still a good choice for players transitioning out of the middle game due to ease of access of the characters and how good some of them are in different game modes. If you are a multi-hit player, I think you should try and focus your resources mainly on Ragnar. I wouldn't necessarily spend too much more elsewhere, since the Custodes team may usurp them. For Ragnar, I would upgrade both the active and passive, but Warhowl is the more important of the two abilities. If the team ends up having some staying power, I think there are two flavors to it. There are the Orcs alongside Ragnar who have been used successfully against Call and Magnus on occasion. Both Orcs are good choices to upgrade for legendary release events too, and Snotflogger's shards are in high supply organically, so he will likely be one of the first characters people will get to upgrade to Mythic anyway. If you like the Orc variation, then I would suggest upgrading Snotflogger's passive and Golgortz's active. There's also the new Dark Angels variant, mainly for Magnus, but Forecast also does some cool things in the Call boss fight, where he helps you deal with some of the extra spawns that start this battle. The nice thing about this variation is that you don't really need to bring Forecast's skills up. If you like the team, you can just bring Forecast to Adamantine 1 and be happy to save your Imperial badges elsewhere. The final raid team is the Custodes team. Carrion is my favourite character in the game at the moment, and this is definitely the team I am planning on focusing on building, even over the Mech team, just because I love their gameplay loops. Sadly, the team requires both heavy investment in gear and abilities. With the exception of Dante's active and Trajan's active, I think you're going to want to invest in basically everything else. I'm still going to do it because I think the team is really good and will be my go-to option for the start of the Mythic era. I've taken this slide from my Custodes video, which I would recommend if you want to get to grips with this team and how to optimize them. The top row, Ragnar's active, Carrion's passive, and Trajan's passive are probably the most important abilities for this team, but you really want to invest in most of the abilities if you want to maximize them. Looping back to other game modes, I think at least for the first few months you want to focus on just getting your raid characters up. Legendary release events are a really interesting one. The problem with legendary release events is that you can't necessarily target characters for specific events due to the rotational nature of both the events as well as the tracks and restrictions. My attitude towards legendary release events has always just been to pick characters who will consistently push deep into events due to the nature of their kits. To that end, I've listed a couple of characters who I would consider legendary release event stalwarts. I've left on screen my recommendations either in terms of abilities or gear if you're interested in building those characters up. Anyway, I've rambled for long enough. Thanks to my Patreons, and if you are a newer player, I'd love if you could enter my referral code on screen. It earns you some rewards and supports me in the work that I do. Bye for now.